The starting point for my talk today is a pretty obvious problem. Nina talked about it. The entire news system is designed for daily content production, not designed in any way for public understanding. I have an idea for a modest improvement that I'm going to describe in this short talk. I'm not sure it's a big idea, but it's a small thing that can be done about a big problem. Next slide, please. That's not the next slide. That's not it either. Next, after that. Okay, so here's a bizarre little headline that came across my social feed on September 21st. It says that the Department of Justice has designated New York City an anarchist jurisdiction. The local news station WNBC picked it up. It has a helpful image of an exploding police car that was actually taken from several months before, just to add to the feel of anarchists taking over the world, which is ironically juxtaposed to people in Central Park hanging out. But this was an actual thing that happened. The Department of Justice tried to call New York City an anarchist jurisdiction. You might say that it's kind of a silly example of information overload, except for one thing. Next slide, please. That's a pretty good example of what Steve Bannon told the author Michael Lewis in February of 2018 in a quote that's become kind of famous. Steve Bannon said, "The Democrats don't matter." In other words, political opposition isn't how we're going to govern. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. I don't consider Bannon a very intelligent man, but this was an insightful description of Trump's propaganda method, which works by overwhelming us, flooding the zone, making it impossible for anyone else to be heard. Next slide, please. As Nina indicated, this has become known as the Russian style of propaganda, the fire hose of falsehood, it's sometimes called. Here are some characteristics of it. It's high volume, multi-channel, shameless in its willingness to distribute untruths, often mixed with a few specks of truth to add to the confusion. There's no commitment to, requirement for consistency across messages. You can contradict yourself endlessly. Rapid, continuous, repetitive in its messaging. The point of this fire hose is not to persuade people, but to confuse and overwhelm them, dishearten them. It both assumes a low trust environment and lowers trust further in the belief that as trust evaporates, powerful people will have the advantage. The number of arguments you put out matters more than their quality, in part because you're just trying to overwhelm people, but also because the coalitions that emerge from this method are people who don't necessarily agree with each other on everything, but there's one thing they feel very strongly about, and that's what binds them to the leader. And of course, the purpose is to drown out competing messages just through sheer volume. Next slide, please. We're living in a civic emergency. I think all of us know this intuitively. Our newsrooms, though, are built on daily routines that have not adapted well to information abundance. There is currently no way to stop the endless flood of daily content production by the news system and switch to any kind of emergency setting in news. The news system doesn't have an emergency setting. It can't switch modes, as it were. Next slide. And that's why I'm introducing the concept of urgency index. This is a simple way of beginning to address what I just described. It's a dead simple newsroom product. It would live online. It'd have a URL. It could also be a newsletter or a phone alert. And it's a simple list of threats and problems that are in the news, not necessarily because they're new today. Rather, they're ranked by how urgent they are to the public, to the public you address, to the community that you're trying to inform. In my imagination of it, it would be remade weekly or more often if something important happened. And you rank each story by a combination of how consequential it is, the likelihood of the threat happening, and the imminence or a nearness of it to our lives. You put those three together, and that's what creates the urgency ranking. Next slide, please. This is my simple sketch of it. You can see why I'm a writer and not an illustrator from this, but it has 5 big possible threats and dangerous problems listed there with a short description of each one, links to know more or to learn about what we can do about it. And you can tell what its ranking was the previous week. And that's the entire idea. I mocked it up as a product of Time magazine, but it could be, of course, any news site. Next slide, please. This is what you need to create an individual entry in the urgency index. You need a headline. This is from April, how I imagine it might happen in April of this year. The headline could be, "Where are the tests?" referring to the problem of testing in COVID. A short description of why it's so critical that we get more tests. A couple of links so for people to learn more about it. You just do that 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 times, and you have your urgency index. That's what I mean by a modest improvement. It's a very simple method. Next slide, please. Here are some of the benefits and purposes. It's noise reduction. You can finish it. It's not a doom scroll. It's the antidote to the doom scroll. It introduces some hierarchy into a flood of news. It's not what matters today or will matter one day, but is trying to register persistent importance day to day, week to week. When, for example, it was really important for us to start testing for COVID, that didn't disappear the day after it was big news. It was true persistently over time. It creates something that forces the newsroom to think a little bit differently, not daily, but currency. It doubles as a priority list for your assignment desk, especially the production of explainers. And when new threats make it onto the index, that itself is a kind of event worthy of an alert. Next slide, please. A related recommendation that I've also written about is the big national newsrooms need threat modeling teams. Threat modeling is a discipline in IT and computer security, and in counterterrorism, in public health. And it tries to anticipate what could be a threat. Similar to the way each newsroom has their own polling unit, each newsroom needs its own threat modeling team, which would be a mix of experts, editors, and beat reporters with expertise. The job is to try and game out what could happen next, especially, for example, in anticipation of the November election, which allows you, instead of just reacting to the latest explosion of news, to anticipate where the news is going. Part of it is scanning for weak signals, things that are just starting now that are possibly going to get way bigger, like the eruption of a new virus in Wuhan. And the product of the threat modeling team could be the urgency index as I've described it. Next slide, please.
All right, Jay, we have just a minute left. Perfect.
That's the last slide. The old front page system was a hierarchy of what's new today, not of what's true today, or better yet, what's still true, even though it was news 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago. So that's why I proposed the urgency index as an answer to the question, what in the daily flood of occurrences should I treat as most important, most disruptive? Thank you for your attention.